told it to save, it did a post with the ID on the parameter, which is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do it with hook. And so what it did is just change the method to put. And everything else it just kind of figured out. That makes sense? Now you might be noticing, Eric, what about HATEOAS? Why did you not use HATEOAS? Well, this is the default Angular resource thing. The capability of doing this is from this particular file here that I included. This is AngularJS people, they created this. And so I used this first, and I'm like, man, this doesn't support HATEOAS. This makes me very sad. And I was sad. Then I looked out to see if there was something out there. It's like, is there anything with Angular that will actually support HATEOAS with the resource? And there actually is. And here it is. Apparently not by the Angular people, but something you can use. And I was going to use it. And then I ran out of time, because I also had to learn other things too. So, this is the kind of thing that you can get if you have a consistent REST-based pattern. Okay? You can start making, you can make inferences. Just like if you used an ORM. Okay? If you use an ORM, you can generally point it at a table and say, here's the schema. Maybe you're defining it in a config file. Maybe you're defining it in code. Maybe you're doing something where it goes and reads the table and pulls it in, and you've got this metadata. But then all you have to do on that object is say, okay, read, save, delete, all that kind of stuff. You don't have to write all the queries, because it can look at the table and say, well, here's the shape of the table. I can then generate all of this other stuff anytime I want to. That's what you can get if you follow consistent methods. But what about the hate and the HATEOAS? Because I didn't have time to figure out how that worked, whenever I did my jQuery implementation of this, and this, like I mentioned to all of you or some of you earlier, I did this at lunch today, because I wasn't really planning on doing this implementation. But then today, I apparently ate something bad for breakfast and thought, at lunch today, I'm going to go get some pho and bang out a jQuery implementation, which for some reason I forgot to take out some of the English stuff. All right, so here's my jQuery implementation. It is in some ways uglier, but for those who don't know Angular at all, we'll go with, oh, this is the same kind of poor quality jQuery that I might be writing. Anyway, here's the page. I have a container. I made a single page app. Here it is. And I mean, by single page app, I mean that very loosely. jQuery, HTML. Okay. I didn't build in history support. I didn't have time to do that much today. Sorry. I'm not lazy. I just have a lot to do this month. And I can only learn so many things at one time. So jQuery implementation. So if I go view here, URL didn't change. Like I said, I have no history thing. But there you go. You've got a single little page there. If you want to do edit, I can do this. I can say, well, that's the wrong year. I can hit save. And then I can go to crime and punishment, and there's my 1867. Okay? I can't use the back button because, like I said, I didn't put in history support. But all of that's there. Then I won't go through all of it because it looks just like the other one. I use the same CSS, so it looks like the other one. You just don't have history support, and it's not as cool. So when this is implemented, you've got a number of templates. I'm using _JS. It's a great little library. It gives you some functional, basically some functional functions to put on like collections and whatnot. It also comes with basic templating. It's really, really great, _JS. _JS, I think, is the URL. All right, we'll come back. So here's a template. It's got these alligator mouths right here for defining variables. You could also put basic loops and stuff within the template. So I have a list template. So when I get the API data back, which is coming back as JSON, I'm going to take that JSON. Here's this template, smash them together, and put that on the page. Here's the edit template. You've got a few replacement variables for title, author, and year. Same with the add template, except it doesn't have the replacement variables because you're creating something new. Here's the detail that just has title, author, and year. And then there's my JavaScript files. Now, in terms of those, I put all the jQuery stuff in this one file. It's 130 lines long, if you don't count the white space at the bottom. And it's not all that remarkable as far as jQuery code goes. Don't take this as any sort of example of best practices. But in terms of the things that you might want to know about, first is, here's the underscore. It is, to use underscore, you put an underscore in the code, which is kind of cool, I guess. It's like jQuery. Well, we can't use the dollar because everybody uses jQuery. So we'll use underscore. Anyway, so underscore.template, you pass it in HTML, and you actually get a function back. So this edit template here is a function. So later on, when I want to use edit template, I can go down here and say, here's the data. So I'm doing an AJAX call to the resource being my URL I got through HATEOAS. And I get this data back because I put no error handler because it's always an error. And I wrote this at lunch today. So edit template's a function. I pass in that, it's a function that's taken that template and knows what to do. So I pass in the data into the function and I get HTML out. And I put that HTML in the DOM with the tag. And then I'm wiring up, save, click, delete, click, and then calling update or delete. The great thing about saying that I did this at lunch today is it basically excuses all the horrible things I did in this file. So you don't really know if something I did is by choice, because I'm a loser, or because I was in a hurry. Gotcha. So anyway, now in terms of the resource thing, I do want to show you this. So here's the to list. All right, to list gets called pretty much immediately when document ready fires. To list, it goes to API book, gets all of the books, and then puts them in the container. And what that looks like in terms of and the template is this. List template, it has in here a href data-resource is the book links self, and then the href in that link. So then I could, on the server, for whatever reason I want to, change the URL of where you would get the saving or getting associated comments or whatever. I could change it on the server. The client doesn't need to change. I would still have QA test it, but the client doesn't need to change because there's no hard-coded URL for all of these links except for just the one to get the book. And so then I just use that. And so whenever we are in, where is it? Close this Angular stuff. jQuery implementation. Here it is. So that when we are in the list, I'm saying, okay, whenever somebody clicks on the view button, and this should not be an ID, oops, call the toDetail and pass in the data resource tag. toDetail being this is now the URL. I'm just going to do a get to that URL. Okay? That's a very simple use of hyperlinking in HATEOAS within the context of an API. Okay. Any questions about that? There you go. There's Node, some REST stuff, jQuery, Angular. One go. All one time. Now you know my last 2 weeks. All right. So to me, really consistency is very important in these URLs. All right. The developers, my job, when they go to the API, because we don't actually have a lot of consistency or much consistency about this stuff, they always have to look at the code. What do I pass? Well, I can't know by any of the structure. I can't know by any of the conventions anything. They either have to ask someone, how do I do this thing? Or they have to look in the code and just figure it out themselves. So consistency in URLs helps with that. Consistency in new resource shape helps with this. And by resource shape, I mean book, whether you're doing a get, whether you're doing a post, whether you're doing a put. The resource shape is exactly the same, or very close, preferably exactly the same, right? If you ever had an API, a REST API, you have these, a REST API where you call a resource, and depending on what parameters you pass, you You get a completely different type of object out of that resource. You ever done that? I have. It's kind of annoying. You don't know what to expect. You pass stuff in, you may get this, you may get that. So you ever used a store procedure in a database where depending on what parameters you pass in, you get different numbers of result sets. It's like, yay, Christmas, I got 7 result sets this time. Awesome, instead of 4. By having a consistent resource shape, simplifies so many things. Consistent use of the HTTP status verbs and consistent use of status, the verbs and the codes. And this really, really means that you get to limit this interactivity. The code you have to write to interact with an API. Because things can be assumed and therefore to a certain degree automated and sometimes tweaked. I had to tweak the Angular thing on one thing to do the put like I wanted. But that's a little tweak. And then I got all the other stuff. Okay? Now, there's something else I wanted to mention. It just came into my head. Now I've totally forgotten it. Now would be a good time for questions, since none of you are talking at all. Anything. Or was this just too much? Or too little and you're extremely bored? Yes.
One question. If you go back to your Node, the server.js code.
Yes.
I noticed in there that you widen the delete for the book. What if I wanted multiple controllers? At what point would I?
What you're talking about? 159?
Yeah, 159.
Okay.
So you have server, let's say server.delete, server.get, whatever it is, right? And then you have that URL pattern. What if I wanted to separate things out into different JavaScript files? So I had something for book, something for some other object, let's say. I would need to pass at some point the query string coming in to be able to extract that little piece to say, hey, I really want to go to this particular JavaScript file and get stuff from there.
So you're talking on the server side?
Yeah, on the server side.
Okay. So the way that Express does it is, in terms of what gets called, it's doing pattern matching on the URL and on the verb. And so if you want to have a slightly different one, it calls a different JavaScript file. Function. And that calls something else. Because this is a different URL, and it's therefore going to match a different pattern.
I guess I don't see anything called book.js where I would bury all that.
Oh, do you mean getting stuff out of this file?
Yeah. So
that's what you mean. Okay.
Yes.
So it's not about the URLs. It's about you don't want everything in one single file.
Exactly.
Okay, here's how you do that. So see the book here, thing I have here, this model? Right. So I have this subfolder for models. So this is mine. This is not Node code. So what I did is I have a folder called models. And then in it, I have a book.js file, all right? So I define this book, and then I say exports.book equals book, which means here, I can use it just by kind of require the file and then give me the book out. So what you would do for these is you would do one of two things. You would either say, okay, take all the content out of this out. Ooh, that was way too much scrolling. Take all the content out of this file out, put that into an external thing, and you just have your pattern matching here, and then you call, this is the get single thingy, and you pass in request body.id. Okay?
Right.
And you define that in a separate file and expose it just like this. You want me to do that?
No, that I understand that bit.
Okay.
That's not quite what I was asking.
Then I don't understand what you're asking.
Go back to the original code. Okay, you had server.get/API/book. Let's say I had 20 different things, book, car, whatever.
Yes.
Right? I want to know how I can dynamically say, I want to inject a, call it an object that would respond to that middle part.
Oh, okay, okay. So if you're building a warehouse and app and you have potentially a bazillion things. Okay.
Right.
Here's how I would. Here's off the top of my head the way I do this. Okay. This then becomes a parameter. or sorry, thingy, becomes a parameter. Okay. Then out here, you would say request.params.thingy var, and this is the obj you want to get. Okay. Then what I would do is I'd say, okay, somewhere else I'm going to have essentially an object. Right? You got it?
Yep.
Everybody else got it? Var thingies.
Yeah.
And book. And there will be an object here that has methods on it, and lamp. Lamp. Dog. Anywhere else.
Right.
Look it up. Thingies. Dot. Well, object.
Right, and that's how you can call out different areas. Yep.
Yeah. That would be really easy to do. There are property related patterns too, but that's right off the top of my head what I would do.
Right, I didn't think you could have like multiple parameters on that. Yeah.
Should be able to. Shouldn't be a problem. Thingies.
So in that case, then you would pass that ID into your other, like, for the second parameter, you'd use that in the other file.
You get the dogs.
The thingy would send you to whatever, and then over there you do the other route.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, answered my first question. My second question is this: when you put this scene as a parameter, do you need to declare whatever kind of a type? In the traditional database, you have to define either it's characters, whatever it is. But nowadays, book, if you strictly API into the whatever MongoDB or whatever, it's no SQLDB. So do you need to create a data? For example, the book could be the picture, could be the video file, could be the whatever it is.
Document stores are very different than relational. In the relational, you define your schema and everything has to match the schema.
Right.
You could potentially do the same thing, into the same document store collection. You could insert completely different shapes of objects in that.
So you don't care what kind
I'm guessing
type of
you would not ever do that, because that sounds like a horrible idea, but you could theoretically do that. And over time, you could add properties. But I would also assume that if you do that, then you're always going to have to keep a level of backwards compatibility, or you're going to have to go back and update all of the previous ones to add those properties, so you don't have to have the backwards compatibility. But you could say this is a schemaless database. It will let you put anything in there.
Right. So you don't need it. Don't need any properties.
For all of this, the only thing in terms of type that I really had to deal with was the format of the object ID itself. Okay. And for using this particular driver for Mongo, I had to use their object ID property. I had to take a string and then turn it into this object ID to query. But that's probably just a characteristic of this particular MongoDB driver. You wouldn't necessarily have to do that.
Yes, three-part question. How long has this RESTful API technique or technology been around?
Mm-hmm.
How widespread is it
Yes.
for implementation in the industry?
Yes.
And what are some of the big companies?
How long? What's the second question?
Like how widespread is it?
All right, so how long has this really been around? The idea of REST is not about APIs per se. This is a dissertation by Roy Fielding. This came out of 2000. This came out of work on the World Wide Web. So, in this dissertation, and I've read about half of it, and it's very approachable. And I would recommend it. Roy Fielding. He, I think, is the first one to ever use the term REST, and goes into quite a bit on this is REST. But he's not talking about APIs. He's talking about the web, right? And I believe, if I remember my history, and some of you who read this, I don't know if everyone's read this, this is in the context of moving from HTTP 1.0 to 1.1 and improving the web. And part of this is to say, here's a much better web in terms of how things work. And so REST APIs, the concepts from REST APIs are pulled from this. Now, not entirely, because this is about the web, and there's a lot of things about the web in general that don't immediately apply to APIs. And as you read through this, you'll see quite a number of them. But a lot of the ideas do, like some of the ones we were talking about. The difference between what is it, representation, status codes, the consistencies, the hyperlinking, that is all in here. So at least the term, you go 14 years back. Now, that's REST. In terms of when people started talking about REST APIs, I don't know, but it's been a number of years. Does anybody happen to know when people started talking about APIs in terms of REST? I don't know. But I remember just anecdotally in my own .NET world, which of course .NET was behind in terms of REST adoption. I started programming in '99, and back then you used SOAP. And it was probably about 4 years later that I started hearing about REST, 5 years later, 6 years later. At that point I was still using SOAP, but I'd heard about it, and it's some of the stuff that some of the other weird open source people use, right? Later on, people realized, oh wait, this is actually pretty cool. And so REST is incredibly common now, and even the .NET. Now, in terms of how many people use it, a lot of people use it. It is becoming more and more and more widespread. In many ways, the widespreadiness of this is a reaction to SOAP. Who's here dealt with SOAP? Okay, SOAP is only somewhat pleasurable to deal with if you have something that can do a great deal of code generation for you to make SOAP endpoints work. Okay, in the .NET world, .NET has a great object generation thing for SOAP. You can point it at a WSDL, which is a definition language for SOAP, and it'll generate all sorts of classes for you to use. And so it's like using an API, except you're just using your C# stuff. And then, so there was simple SOAP stuff in the .NET world, and then it got very complicated, where SOAP kept evolving, and it's probably still evolving. I just completely ignored it at this point. But SOAP has a lot to it. It actually has a lot of things that REST doesn't have. Okay, REST doesn't really have the concept in it of transactions, of multiple requests, and then at the end of these, roll this back. Okay, databases have this because for some things you absolutely need this, because sometimes you can't do an operation against a database and expect it and be finished the first time. You have to do this, do this, do this, do this, and if it fails on step 5, you roll everything back, not just 5, not manually roll back, but the database support just say, roll back that whole transaction, and it rolls back everything. REST has no concept of this at all, because the web has no concept of this at all. REST is based on those principles. The web is meant to be stateless. Okay? When you make a request to a server, it doesn't, it starts the request, the response gets back, and it's done. It doesn't keep open a request unless you're doing something like long polling or WebSockets. The default use of the web is get a thing, get it back, close the connection. That's a scalability thing, because then once I get a web page, I can sit and read that web page for hours. Like if you get my blog, you can read my blog for hours, but you're not connected to my server anymore because you just made the request and you got it back. SOAP gives you that kind of thing because it's layering on top of normal HTTP transactions. So there's lots in SOAP that you just don't have in REST at all. But REST, compared to SOAP, is really simple. If you're in client-side JavaScript and you need to call a SOAP endpoint, I've never done this, but I would assume it would be a horrific experience. Because you're going to go huge blob of XML that you're going to have to go through, and then you're going to be submitting huge blobs of XML that you're just tunneling through HTTP. Very, very unpleasant. REST, yeah. it's pretty straightforward in every language that I've ever seen. REST is pretty easy to do because REST itself is a fairly simple idea. And, well, it's built on basic HTTP, really basic stuff. And so if your platform has a client, has the capability of doing HTTP, you can build REST on top of it. So you have to get HTTP and a whole lot of XML stuff, and then a whole lot of schema stuff of knowing here's exactly how you form various XML things. So because of these things, REST is not defined as not SOAP, but REST has become more widespread because some people use SOAP and thought this seems a little bit complicated. Now in terms of who uses REST, Twitter uses REST, Amazon uses REST, Twilio uses REST, their SMS voice stuff. RunScope uses REST. Azure uses REST. REST is growing and growing and growing because SOAP is not easy to approach for some people. Though for some applications, it's what you got. Another advantage of SOAP over REST. REST has there is no well-known, decided upon way of documenting REST services. Okay? There is for SOAP. It's called WSDL, Web Service Definition Language. You can put all sorts of definitions, so types, how stuff functions, hierarchies of things in this Web Service Definition Language file, and that's why code generation on top of SOAP works. Because even though SOAP is incredibly complicated, you can describe all of SOAP in WSDL. REST takes the opposite approach. It's very simple, and if you follow the simple patterns, you can still do the code generation because you're following the simple patterns. But if you use HTTP and do lots of weird stuff, you can't use the patterns, and you kind of have to think on a per API basis every time you make a call. Okay, what is the shape of the stuff I have to send in? Because I can make no assumptions in terms of consistency. So it's very widespread. Everybody's using it these days, unless they're a bank or something like that. And a lot of large companies still have lots of infrastructure built on SOAP. And .NET still builds SOAP stuff. And probably will because they have lots of enterprise customers. Startups, and so not usually. Yeah.
2 questions. Would you say SOAP is cleaner than REST? I'm just kidding. Okay. Second question. This is kind of related to hyperlinking and HATEOAS. How would you go about handling that with versioning, like versioning of your API? I see from the client side the benefit there because the endpoint or the URI is basically passed through. So if you needed to roll out a new version, as long as nothing functionally changed, your client side wouldn't have to change. But how would you handle that from a resource standpoint, server side?
In Express, I don't know. Restify's way of handling this is awesome. Let me show you how they do it. And how you do it is going to be different. Let's talk implementation, then let's talk theory. Okay. In terms of implementation, we find where they do it. Version routes. See this here? Where this is attempting to have an Express style URL. We'll get it to stop. Oh, highlight it. Here we go. Express style URL, but this is not Express. This is not for serving static files or even dynamic HTML. This is just for APIs. And the way they do it is they say server get and then the path, like path hello name, same format as before. But if they pass in this version, then call this in v1 version of the resource. If they pass in this version, they too. And by version, what we're talking about is the accept version header. Okay? There's an accept version header. This is for this thing. It's for saying, I want this particular version of the resource. If you have a resource like the book, all right, like I have here, Dragons of Autumn Twilight was written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. I put that in one field. Margaret Weiss, comma, Tracy Hickman. At some point, I'm going to realize, you know what? That's a bad idea. What it really should be, because this is much easier to parse in the client, is it should be an array of authors for a book, because you can have more than one author in the book. At that point, you need to make the choice of, okay, is this a new resource? Completely new resource. Or is this a new version of this resource? In this particular case, I think it's fairly obvious. This is not a new resource. It's returning back all the same data. It's just returning it back in a slightly different form. And so this is a good case for a new version. And so if I was using Restify in this case, I would then do this. Version 1 returns it back as a string. Version 2 returns it back as an array. If you have existing clients out there, I'm assuming they're either going to pass no version or version 1. And so they'll continue to get, after you've made the change, they'll continue to get version 1, which returns back the 2 authors in a single string common delimiter. But if they pass version 2, that means they know that your API changed, and they are now expecting the array coming from the resource. Now let's give another example. Let's say there's a book. As we define it here, I later on decide, you know what? I want to add a book review to this book. And I want to add the ISBN number to this book. And I want to add the publisher to this book. What do? Well, I could do one of 2 things in this case. One, I could add all of those properties to the existing resource as it is, and I could choose to version or not. You know, hopefully the client wouldn't barf if you added more properties. That could be dangerous depending on who's using your API. But I could do that, and I could just add this stuff to the existing resource, and then it just starts returning it. Versioned or not, that's up to you. The negative of that now is, whenever you use the API/book without the ID parameter on the end, you're now returning a whole lot more data, because then you have a big text blob of a book review of a book. This now quite drastically changes the amount of data coming back, which may not be a very good idea. So what you can do instead of versioning the API in that particular case is you can say, you know what, let's make this a different resource. It's API/book or API/full book or extended book or something like that. And that is then going to return a representation of a fuller look at that book. Now, in terms of your database on the back end, what you're probably not going to do is you don't want to store those 2 things separately. Whenever you start adding these new fields to those objects, you're going to get your original smaller book from Mongo, or whatever your store is. You're going to add this new stuff, and you're going to put it back in Mongo. So then, depending on what API someone calls, if they call just regular book, you're just going to send back the original 4 parameters: ID, title, author, and year. But if you do the other API, which is a different representation of this same on the back end resource, you're going to send all the data back to that thing. Because it is, as far as you're concerned, either for whatever constraints you have, or just because of the semantics, the meaning here, you're like, this is a different resource, so therefore I'm going to put it at a different URL. To me, it's breaking the rules to where if you are on this particular API/book, if you are to return the full details in all cases, well, like in the get with ID, but you don't return the full details on the get without the ID, because at that point you're creating an inconsistency. And client code, who knows to expect this data on the get on ID, may assume that you're going to be sending that back on the full list with that code. And so you're breaking the consistency. You can't leverage that understanding, and you're then hurting the consumer of the API. So in that case, you would create a new resource. Now, that it becomes a harder question if you just want to add to these pieces of data ISBN number. It's not a large chunk of data. There's no constraint there. That's a small number. Do you add a new property without versioning? Do you add a new property with versioning? Or you create a new resource? It depends on the case. I would not create another resource for that. That seems an extension of that resource. So then I would have to decide, okay, what's the likelihood that's, let's say somebody in their code gets the data back and is looping through all the properties in the data and assigning it directly to an object in their code, saying, oh, I'm going to loop through things, and it picks an ISBN, it tries to assign it to an ISBN property on the code which doesn't exist. You've now broken the client. So if you control all the clients and you know they didn't do that, then you can just add it to that resource, and there's really no harm there. But if you don't, it depends on your level of risk aversion. Just create a new version and handle it that way.
Okay. And the actual assignment of the resource link that gets returned back through the kind of HATEOAS model. Do you usually do that in a model within your API, or is it usually, do you usually set it up as like a function or a utility that you take your model and pass it through to generate that?
It's really going to depend on what you want to do. It depends on it might also depend on your language that you're using. It's really up to you. You do it on the server because that's the one that knows all the state. In our particular case, there's no state except for what the ID of the book is. But there could be state in terms of authorization, or in terms of context, or whatever, or even AP. What is the state of your internals? If you have an organization like we do, where we have write and read servers, where you write to one and replicates to the reads. If your write goes down, well, you know what you can do on your APIs. You can say, oh, the write's down, the write server's down. Don't return any to edit links, and so no one can edit. And that's just a way of just passing that down to the client. So all that is kind of states. You know those states on the server. So whether it's a model like I did it there,
Right.
The problem with that is, that's just a book model. If there's state outside of that book model, well, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe I need another function that has access to all the state, or multiple functions that have access to various different parts of state. So you can pass a model through so we can make decisions on, okay, no edit links for this because the write server's down. No delete things for this because this person does not have rights to delete that resource or whatever. So it depends on your language of choice, or just your patterns that you like.
So in Node.js APIs, right? If you want to add some instrumentation or metrics, you want to gather, is there a library or a JavaScript thing which you can annotate or something?
Sure, and how you do it is going to depend on your web framework. I'll show you a simple way of doing this in Express. And so we can say server.use. I think, I'm hoping I remember the syntax correctly. I think I do. Here I can say console.log. You requested. Okay. Next. Now, if I go back here, my node process, I want to restart that now. So now when I go here and I say that you requested API/book, or no, excuse me, API/jQuery. No? Oh, sorry. This is a reference to the API. This requested API/book. Okay. What if we go to the edit link? Now you requested API book, and then there's your ID. So in Express, this is the idea of what they call middleware, where you have your main functions, which is just you get things, but you can basically set things up that happen in the middle. It's sort of like auxiliary functions that will fire in the request pipelines. So if you think of requests coming in, lots of things can happen, and then your actual handler happens, and then lots of other things can potentially happen. This is how you define middleware in Express, where you pass in a function, you do what needs to happen, and then you call the next. So the next thing calls the next piece of middleware, and so on and so forth down the chain. But it's different in different languages. In .NET and MVC, you have filters. You can use filters for that. Or you could technically use HTTP modules if you're a .NET person for that kind of thing. If you're cutting edge in the .NET world, you can use something called OWYN, which is more really thinking about middleware in terms of this kind of definition. If you're a Ruby person, you can use Rack. In the Node world, there's a general one called Connect. Most web frameworks generally have a capability for doing this kind of thing. Like at work, we're about to start making some pretty major changes to our API. One of the things we're going to be doing is API logging, just so we know exactly how many people, who and how many people call which APIs how often, that kind of thing. We're going to do it as probably as an MVC, as an action filter. But this is basically a middleware function. You don't need to define that kind of metrics gathering here in server.get. You can do it generically and just plug it in, and it just starts gathering up that data for you. So that's how I would do it in the context of Express is with middleware, or try to find logging Express and then see if there's a Node package for that. But if there is, they probably did it like this. Yes.
How about performance? When you ask the resource, is there any way kind of like whatever memory or CPU scalability, or is there any way you can talk performance?
Yeah, you can tell just by gathering metrics like execution time, that kind of thing. I bet if you did a search for node metrics, you could find something that probably some middleware that could tell you something about that. If you're concerned about performance, one of the ideas of REST is to work like the web. Well, at least in terms of GET operations, the web already has a number of built-in mechanisms for caching, headers for caching, and e tags for knowing if basically the state of an object. You leverage those, you can basically start caching. And you can get better performance. The fastest request to a web server is the request you don't make, because you will run out of cache. And so there's that. So if you want to measure performance, you could just do it with middleware like this. Or you could find a package. I've not tried to do that. So even in .NET, I haven't really tried that very much, and that's where I spend most of my time.
Are some verbs in HTTP faster than others?
No. It's really just going to be a verb. I mean, a verb is just it's a verb that you're passing down to say, system, do this operation. Depending on what you're doing, that will drastically affect the speed of how this works.
Someone might have cared
Updates.
a lot more about get than push.
Yeah, it's really going to be if you're storing data and you're updating it, it's going to be your data store. Like let's say you're dealing with a relational database. Okay, you do an update to a table for an object, right? The speed of that update is going to be directly related to the amount of data in that table and the indexes you use to find the data in that table. And so the way the relational databases work, and then other types of databases in terms of indexing, is you have all this data stored, and it's stored in on disk in such and such state at this place. So however it's stored, the fastest way to get the data will be to get the data off of disk in the order that is actually stored. But you often do queries on things not based on that, but based on various properties of the thing you're storing. And so what they do in relational databases and others is they create indexes that are saying, okay, if someone's asking by the year, if we take our book, if they want to find all books that were published in 1984, you create an index on year. And it basically says, okay, here's these years, and here's the pointers to essentially where this data is stored on disk. So you want to get year, you don't have to look through all of this data. You'll go to the index, which is organized in that shape. You get those pointers, pull that out, and return it. And so that's where your bottleneck is going to be. It's really when you're interacting with the server is your data source. And some data stores are going to be faster at getting than they will at saving. And some of them are going to be faster at inserting than they will at updating. Some will be faster at deleting than getting. So it entirely depends. This is what you can't make any rule. It entirely depends on your data source and what you've done for performance tuning your data source. 100% depends on that. So you can't make really a generic statement about making data sources behind APIs fast, because it's really...
You may not always have a data source behind the get or post either.
You may not, and chances are that it's going to be faster, just in terms of raw performance. Assuming you're not getting, performance is there, assuming you're not getting completely pegged and your CPU is not, at 100%. But if you don't have a data source, then you probably have easier performance characteristics.
How about this compared to the kind of Mango data, DB, this kind of NoSQL data? Compared to, I understand the relational database that indexing you already talking about. But how about the NoSQL database? This is strictly depending on the an I/O or something?
I have not used MongoDB in a production deployment. I can make no comment at all on its performance. However, I can say a true statement about it. MongoDB is going to be significantly faster than some data stores, and significantly slower than others. A better person to ask about MongoDB performance is that guy right there. That guy right there. No. He's probably done more than me. It really is data store specific, and the only people you can ask in terms of performance, what's MySQL versus Mongo? Well, find someone who's done both, or find a blog post that's done both to compare the two. And it's not going to be Mongo is faster than SQL Server. It's going to be Mongo is faster in these areas than SQL Server, and in these conditions, SQL Server is faster than these others. Unless you have a data source out there that's just hacked and completely unoptimized, you're probably not ever going to have a clear winner. This is always faster in some stats based on use case.
Yeah, exactly. Mongo's not right for lots of things. And so it really just depends on what you need to do.
How about I'm working in a project on kind of a social network, similar like to the WhatsApp or the WeChat, the Chinese version. So in this kind of situation, whenever you use the MongoDB or the Hadoop, whatever, so they pretty much restrict to the non-SQL database. So do you think that it's faster than the?
And again, it really is just use case.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not about the subject matter.
Right.
It's how you choose to represent the storage, the subject matter in terms of data structure is really ultimately what it comes down to. And lots of organizations are moving more toward, instead of having, here's our data source, it's here's our multiple different types of data sources. Like even at Match, where most everything runs off of SQL Server, we have regular, traditional, normalized relational tables, if you have experience with those. We also have some very denormalized relational tables. Well, they're not very relational, they're denormalized tables, where instead of having good relational stuff and no duplication of data, it takes all of this structure and flattens it out in one big, ugly table. But it's a lot faster to pull from the one big, ugly table than the hierarchical structure to all the joins. And so you have to optimize for that sort of thing. Another way of doing that entirely is you store your data where you do your CRUD your updates and your deletes and all that in that kind of structure, because you like relational if you do. But then if you want to do something, if you want to actually a better one would be, I would use SQL more for like a searching would probably be good for that, where you have a denormalized table, but you have Mongo is where you store your data, because you're not doing a bunch of joins. You just get a single document out of the database and update it just in it. But when you save it, you then have to tell this other data source, update from this data, so this is not up to date, which of course causes other problems, because this is not up to date for several milliseconds, or several seconds, or several minutes, depending on your latency, which means you can make a change and not see it. We have these problems all the time. The replication, we make a change. I queried the data, it's not there. Why? You didn't query where you made the change, you queried over here, where the data is denormalized, and it takes 5 seconds for that data to get here to here. So it's a scaling thing that solves a lot of problems and creates a lot of headaches. And like 7 databases in 7 weeks, if you want to understand, different problems that these kind of things are trying to solve, that's a good book for that kind of thing. Because React was designed to solve different problems than Redis, which was designed to solve different problems than Postgres. There is no perfect way to store data. There's only a perfect way, or a really good way to store a particular type of data in a certain way, which is the most unsatisfying answer you can ever give to the question of how should I store my data, because it means you have to learn a whole lot to go, what's the shape of my data, and how am I going to be accessing the data? Not just the shape, but how do I want to get it? And it might be multiple different ways, and so you might have multiple different answers. I need 3 separate types of data storage to solve this problem, so I have to have 3 instead of just 1. This is where programming gets much harder.
This is why not everybody does it, but why the people that do are awesome.
Yes, we are awesome.
I will say though, if this is kind of your first exposure to Mongo, definitely check out that. I actually haven't ever heard of that book that you were referencing, but it looks awesome. So check that out. Check out Mongo's website because they do have some really good overviews of use cases that Mongo is a good fit for, as well as there's a similar to the HTML5 meetup user group here. There's a MongoDB user group, and in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's actually a MongoDB employee that kind of heads up that meetup group, and he's done some really good sessions on introductions to Mongo, and can definitely talk more about performance at a very granular level. So,
thank you. I've not heard of this meetup.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I think they just recently formed it as a meetup.
Okay, well, here it is. Looks like.
Yeah, Craig Wilson, I think is his name.
Yeah, he's got the couch on cooking.
Yeah,
Sweet.
he's does really good stuff. Yeah, and I think their office hours are. I think he kind of just sets up at a Starbucks and you can just come and talk with him. I think that's definitely check it out.
Yeah. On the topic of meetups, there's a Dallas Node meetup. We've been meeting for several years now. We're fairly unorganized. You know, any of you guys been to the Dallas Node meetup? Okay, fairly unorganized is speaking too highly. Yes. Do you know we're at the new location? We're at OrgSync. We're at Coit and 635. Come, we have a meeting tomorrow night. We're unorganized. We often don't have a speaker. I don't know what we're going to be talking about at all. I may talk about some of this stuff. I'm going to show up, which means you'll all be bored because you'll hear the same stuff again. But they use Node. They're at OrgSync, and there's always at least one OrgSync there, employee there that can talk about some of the Node stuff that they're doing. So anyway, if you need more meetups and user groups to go to, and you don't mind an unorganized meetup, then you can come. And if you look at the last comment, and I noticed this earlier today, what's the topic for tomorrow? People ask this. Last month, I answered that. Because I said, hey, I'll talk about this thing. I think I'm probably going tomorrow, which if so, I'll respond about missing some of the stuff. Anyway, Dallas Node meetup, it's pretty good. Okay, any other questions? There's a lot more in terms of REST. Oh, and I remembered what I wanted to talk about earlier that I didn't. Okay, so here's one of the things about REST that you will find in some ways possibly frustrating, but also possibly liberating. It's also, how you feel about this may also be determined if you like dynamic languages or not. Because dynamic languages in the same way. Dynamic languages, you can just change things and do whatever you want. You don't have types to protect you. REST is the same way. There's a certain set of principles that if you don't do these principles, you are not RESTful. But there's lots of things that aren't set. Like SOAP has wisdom. Here's exactly how everything is. Here's exactly what the types of all of these properties are. REST does not have that. There is no set way of saying, okay, this REST API returns this object with these 5 values. Here's the types. There is no set standard for that. Several people have come up with, hey, this is how I would do it. This is how I would do it. So there's no set standard. If you stick with the general principles that we've talked about, then you're still going to get a measure of consistency across the general industry. But there's flexibility. Some people are going to do some things differently. Like in terms of HATEOAS, lots of REST people are starting to move to HATEOAS, but it is something that's at least a little bit more new in terms of widespread adoption. I'd never even heard of HATEOAS like 3 or 4 years ago. Never even heard of it. I'm assuming some people were doing it then, but I had never even heard of it. So if you really want to think about REST, look at examples, look at Twitter, look at Azure, look at various examples out there. There's also a number of books. O'Reilly has like 5 or 6 or 7 books on REST, and all of them disagree. Get them, read them. A lot of the principles are going to be the same across all of them. Also, in terms of HATEOAS, there's another option for returning like a link to self. Is there's a header that you can return back whenever you create something. Well, here's a link to that thing. That's the same principle as using HATEOAS because you're returning a link to the thing. But it's a different mechanism. It's sitting back in a header as opposed to a part of the bottom. So that's one of the annoying things about REST. There is no governing body saying this is how it works. It's like dynamic languages. There is no governing body that says this is exactly what this type is supposed to have on it. You can just add it on there if you want to, unless you're doing something like C# where try to assign a property to something that doesn't exist. It's going to say no. You can't do this. So that's one of the annoying things. I find it kind of not cool, but it also means if I see a recommendation that I don't actually like, I like to do it. So we get to control our own destiny, but also get to follow a broad general pattern. So someone could look at my API and go, I see what you did there. And I understand 95% of it. Now I just have to figure out this other thing. But in terms of documentation of documenting an API, that is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. At Match, most of our consumers of our API are ourselves. Our iOS app, our Android app, our mobile web app, all use our API. Documentation would still be useful, but it's less important because you can just walk over to the other guy who worked on the API and say, hey dude, how does this thing work, right? External people, that without having good documentation, that makes it a lot harder. So you have to come up with some strategy. Do you try to embed it somewhere in the code where you can generate documentation from the code, running or statically? Or do you just have a wiki where you, every time you add a property to a thing, you have to remember to go to the wiki and change the thing on the wiki so they can see it? Absolutely the most painful way of doing documentation, but sometimes that's just going to be necessary because you can't embed all this information into a REST API. Sad face. So that's unfortunate. So buy all those O'Reilly REST books and read them. In terms of recommendations, I do have a few books I recommend. And these are O'Reilly books. I like this one, REST API Design Rulebook. It's short and it's very point by point. Here's an idea. Here's an idea. Here's an idea. I like this book a lot. These are both pretty recent. I haven't read either of them all the way through, but I've read good chunks of both. I like them both, and they're slightly different, but they have good ideas. And so if you need a good REST book to go with, if you've never done REST before, probably a big book because they'll give you a little bit more of the theory and the history. If you've done REST or as a complement, one of those, this book is really great. It's got like a bazillion rules in here, and it's short and condensed and awfully nice. So.
The next book will be 7 REST books in 7 weeks, right?
Yes. Exactly.
I'll wait for
you could do
book.
just 7 REST APIs in 7 weeks. That'd be interesting. But yeah, probably not. I don't want to write that book. I will continue to post this material and last month's materials on my blog, and so I don't know if I want to keep adding it to the meetup because I'm afraid that people will think I'm spamming the meetup. I'll tweet it. Follow me on Twitter. Eliak. I'll always tweet whenever I do a blog post. And so if you want to see this in written form, then that would be the place to do it. And the blog posts don't always end up just like the discussion anyway. Like the one I did yesterday had the discussion of middleware in it, and we didn't talk about middleware last month at all. It just came up, and I thought, yeah, this is a good place to talk about it.
And the blog post covered last month's stuff. Went through all the package config very smoothly.
Yes, thank you, Mike, for pointing that out. Those who were here at the last meetup would remember that. One of my less glorious moments. Any other questions or snide remarks? No? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. Let me know if you have any other questions later. Shoot me an email or on Twitter. And here's my contact information. I'll put this down.